Greetings and welcome to Flanigan's Ecologic. I am your host, Ted Flanigan, and today my guest is Julia Kintsch. She is the Principal and Senior Ecologist at EcoResolutions, a company based in Golden, Colorado, that focuses on conservation planning and ecology. She notes that public lands, water, and air are on the chopping block. We're going to be talking about wildlife crossings in Colorado and the importance of taking care of wildlife and motorists on the nation's roadways. Hi, Julia. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ted. Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here, and I'm excited to talk with you and your listeners about wildlife crossings.
Well, it's great. It's super to meet you, and I've done a little bit of digging on you, and I'm pretty darn impressed by what you've done. But let's start off with a few just softball questions. You're in Colorado, I take it. Where are you now?
I'm in Salida, in the Arkansas Valley.
And I saw Golden on your website, so I take it you've moved to Salida.
That's correct. I very recently moved to Salida. I was in the Golden Evergreen area, kind of in the foothills west of Denver for, I don't know, maybe 15 years. But I grew up in Boulder, so.
You did.
Yep.
I saw that you went to UC Boulder. Fantastic. And that's really where you started on your environmental path, right? Yeah,
it is. I think I kind of started at university in a searching mode. I didn't, have a set direction. And I think going to a larger school and being able to explore was really nice. But that is what set me on a path in environmental studies and sciences.
And then there was a bit of a gap before you went to Duke for your graduate degree, right?
Yeah, I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa for a few years. And then after I came back from that experience, I determined that I wanted to pursue my education with a master's degree. And that's how I landed at Duke then.
And that was in landscape ecology. And what does that mean, landscape ecology?
Yeah, great question. It's not about your yard. It's really about thinking about ecological processes and systems at different scales. And certainly, if you think about small fauna, for example, that have a different home range and a different way of moving across the landscape than, for example, a large animal or a whale or something. So we consider all these different wildlife and ecosystem components at all these different scales. And I also put it in the context really of conservation biology. I mean, I think a lot of the work that I do is embedded in that academic arena.
And what do you think influenced you to become so passionate about wildlife?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think being passionate about the natural world is something I grew up with. I was exposed to that, throughout my childhood, and we went hiking and camping and skiing and cross-country skiing. And that, I grew up with open space, basically in my backyard, and I could run up the hillside and, meet friends and turn over rocks or whatever we wanted to do. And so that's just, been such a part of my being. And I think that was really foundational to it. Wildlife ecology specifically is something that I fell into. I didn't study that in school, either as an undergrad or as a graduate student. That's my dirty little secret, as I don't have really a wildlife biology background. But it's something that I came into, when after grad school, when I started working, specifically when I started working at the small little organization called it was a little bit of an awkward name, the Southern Rockies Ecosystem Project, which is then later became part of what's now Rocky Mountain Wild. So a nonprofit organization. And we focused on that Southern Rockies ecoregion. So from Southern Wyoming all the way down through the Rocky Mountains to Northern New Mexico. And we started working on this issue of looking at how roads fragment wildlife habitat. And then I got more and more involved in just thinking about wildlife movement and wildlife corridors and how different types of wildlife respond to roads and road barriers and traffic.
Fantastic. And I love the some of the phraseology from your website, minimizing and mitigating ecological impacts from human activities.
Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful.
No, it's a good one. It's a good mouthful, I think. It's the intersection of the human and the natural environment was another phrase that I resonated with. So
Yeah.
so how did you form Eco Resolutions? You've been doing that. You've been heading up this company for 16 years.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been that long. It's the longest job I've ever had, and I haven't fired myself yet, so I guess that's okay. I was working in the nonprofit world. I'd worked for the Nature Conservancy out in Michigan for a couple of years, and then I worked for this other small nonprofit in Colorado. And I think that nonprofit, we had some leadership issues. It was right before the 2008 recession, and I was burnt out, honestly, on that specific job and the work that we were, and it wasn't the work, like I loved what we were doing in our mission, but I also felt like I wasn't being as effective as I could in the space that I was trying to work in. And specifically, we were the first nonprofit in the state that was working with the Department of Transportation, environmental nonprofit that was trying to work with a transportation agency in Colorado and, not simply call them up out on, like, oh, roads are bad, but how can we work together to address some of these issues and specifically how roads and the highway network fragments wildlife corridors and wildlife movement routes. And so, I got involved in that, and I always felt like we were at the table just a little too late when these transportation projects were happening. So the Colorado Department of Transportation would be, widening a road or something like that. And by the time the outside world found out about it, and we were trying to say, hey, how can we influence this project? A lot of decisions had already been made and, budgets were set. And so what I wanted to do as a consultant was get to the table earlier and be involved in these projects earlier. And I think that's something I've really been able to do in this role that I just couldn't do when I was working for a nonprofit. Is now I'm a consultant. I work with these agencies and they're my client, so I have to understand their needs and what their other objectives are beyond wildlife movement and reducing collisions. And, a transportation agency is going to be focused on safety and the transport of goods and people. That is their mission. And so how can we kind of align these different interests in the same landscape and, do better both by wildlife and for drivers, so that we don't have to worry about hitting animals on the road.
Yeah, that's a great point. That they have this very specific interest to protecting motorists, and then your organization and others are concerned about motorists, of course, but also very concerned about the wildlife. But give an example of like if the Department of Transportation in Colorado or any other state was going to be widening their road, how could you get in there early? I mean, I know an overpass or an underpass might be the ultimate solution, but what other kinds of things can you do? I saw on your website that you talked about different kinds of mitigation measures. What kinds of things could you do in that early design phase of a project?
Yeah, well, there's kind of two questions in there, so I'm going to separate them out a little bit. But I think the first one that you really hit on is getting in on a project early. And so identifying what the need is, what the different species are, and how the road is acting as either a barrier or also, a source of mortality for those wildlife. Yeah. And so understanding what's happening there, and then understanding, okay, well, what are all the other concerns in this landscape? So obviously transportation and safe transportation. There's also a lot of other things that come up with the communities around these corridors where a transportation project is happening, and things like, they have economic concerns, they have recreation interests, they have aesthetic concerns. And so all of this has to come together into figuring out a solution that is implementable, because if it's not implementable, it's not going to happen. It has to be something that is accepted by these, by the community as meeting all of these various needs. And I think when we get in early on a project and understand kind of what the interests and challenges are, we can find those solutions if we have that time. But when you come in later, it's like decisions have been made and, you're just kind of too late at the table. So that piece about being early on a project is really important. And from there, you start to devise, well, what are the mitigation opportunities? What can we do in this landscape? And not every landscape is suitable to a wildlife crossing, an underpass or an overpass. Like sometimes it's because of the terrain, sometimes it's because of the adjacent land use, or there can be other considerations that come up. So we do want to look at other strategies of how can we help to deal with these issues of the barrier to wildlife movement and the safety risk, the safety hazard for drivers. And that's not always crossing structure and fencing. We know those work. They're really, really effective. They can be 80-90% effective. But we have to have other tools in our toolbox because we can't do wildlife crossings everywhere. And so, we have to think a little bit creatively. It depends on the road, for example. If we have a lower volume 2-lane road, so that might be a situation where we could look at, in Colorado, we have right-of-way fencing along pretty much all of our highways. So basically that's often like 4-strand barbed wire fence. Sometimes it's a mesh fence that we call sheep fence. And so that's very impermeable because it has like a 4-inch mesh. And so like a calf or a fawn can't get through that, even if they're, the cow or the doe can jump over the fence, they can get trapped. So we can look at how to make those fences more permeable and less of a barrier. There's wildlife friendly fencing that we can use, or if we don't need fencing at all, are there opportunities to remove that right-of-way fencing? And that can reduce the time that animals are trapped on the roadway and exposed to traffic. And so if we reduce that time and make it easier and faster for animals to cross the road, that could be one way of helping to reduce collisions while keeping the road permeable. So, there's a lot of different things. We also look at like animal detection systems, which is kind of a system that is, for example, we have a thermal or radar detections, like sensors along a roadway. And so when a larger animal essentially is detected by that system, it sets off a driver warning system that lights that say, hey, there's an animal on the road right now. So it's not just the static yellow sign, it's something a little more interactive. Those are still kind of a work in progress because it's also requiring that drivers respond and that they actually slow down in response to that messaging.
And it's so important now is I know up in the mountains where I have my house up near Snowmass, more and more we have elk and moose on the road. These are large animals that if you hit one, which is a bummer, but if you do, they can come right through your windshield. So those warning systems are vital. But that's so interesting what you said about the fencing, that in some cases the fencing is the problem. It captures the wildlife in the roadway as opposed to letting them cross over and scurry off to where they were going. Yeah,
it is interesting. And there's different types of fencing. I mean, fencing is like 8 foot high, what we call wildlife fencing. It's traditionally, for most species, it's 8 foot high. It depends a little bit if you're talking about a mountain lion or a leopard frog. But in general, for deer and elk, we use an 8 foot high fence that ties into wildlife crossings. And that is so essential to have successful wildlife crossings, because a wildlife crossing system, I like to call them systems, because it's not just about the overpass or the underpass. It's also about the fencing that ties into those structures. And the fencing in that case keeps animals off the road and out of the line of traffic. And as animals are learning where those crossing structures are, it helps to guide them to those structure locations.
So you might have to have miles of fencing on either side of a wildlife crossing, right? In order to get them to funnel the wildlife to the crossing. Is that right?
Yeah. And you want to be careful about that because you don't want to have miles and miles of fencing without a crossing opportunity. We want to be conscientious about, and again, it depends. What type of movement is it? Is it a broad landscape movement, or are they moving through a narrow migration corridor where maybe we don't need maybe one crossing and a little a mile of fencing on either side will suffice. But in other places, like in northwest Colorado, we have the largest migratory herds of deer and elk in the nation. And so these animals during those migration seasons are making these kind of mass movements. It's almost like sheet flow across the highway. And so one crossing structure and a little bit of fencing isn't enough. You need multiple crossings with fencing connecting between each of those structures to provide sufficient connectivity for animals to complete those movements. So, that's one example. And that kind of fencing, is what we would call like good fencing in quotes, that, is part of the mitigation system. But some of the other fencing that I was talking about, where we have right-of-way fencing that where animals can get trapped inside the roadway, that's a problem. And that's where we need to think a little bit about like, okay, how can in certain areas, not necessarily everywhere, but how can we make that more permeable for wildlife so they don't get trapped?
I imagine in your career doing this that you've seen these departments of transportation get more and more aware of things like these wildlife corridors, right? I mean, I'm imagining that when you started out, the wildlife must have just been sort of considered a nuisance, and we pretty much want to put the highway through, and that's that. But they must have been very happy to have somebody like you who has this deep interest and would be studying these corridors and figuring out these migration patterns for them.
Well, I think it took a process. It certainly wasn't overnight. I think early on, people were like, why would we do this? Like, what's the point? How are animals going to know to use these things? And that's not our mission. And, I think what's really interesting is that agencies like a Department of Transportation, have traditionally operated in these silos. And so their mission again is, the safe transportation of like goods, services, and people. So that is what they're focused on. And it's exactly what you said. It's like pave it from point A to B and, make sure that the road is going to, be stable. And other than that, we don't care what we go across, because that just wasn't the mindset when we first started, building all these highways across the nation, in the middle latter part of the last century. And so, we just paved it, and that's what we did. And then eventually we started a growing awareness within transportation agencies of like, like how can we maybe cross that landscape and still meet our mission, but with a little bit of a more ecological sensitivity and context. And so, maybe building bridges instead of across the drainage instead of just filling it and creating a bigger barrier. And so it's changed over time. And I think these agencies today have evolved quite a bit and are working more in tandem with their state wildlife agencies, with, the National Forest or the BLM, and with, folks like myself who are trying to help figure out, okay, how can we meet these multiple objectives that align them with your core mission, but also, just do a better job of this work and integrate ecological considerations, whether that's resiliency and climate considerations or connectivity into these projects that we're doing so that they're more sustainable and they're more in the context of the landscape.
Yeah. And I think I've learned over the past few months that 30 or 40% of highway accidents, at least up in the Roaring Fork Valley, are related to wildlife accidents, running into deer and elk and even bear and moose and other things at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it varies a lot depending on where you're talking in the Roaring Fork Valley, or if you're talking in, I don't know, one of the New England states where there's a lot of, at risk and threatened amphibians and reptiles. So it's a little bit of a different issue in different places. Yeah. But the safety component is how we really were able to start having these conversations with departments of transportation, that deer are getting hit on our roads all the time. And deer across the nation, whether it's mule deer in the west or white-tailed deer in the east, are the most common species involved in these types of collisions, in part because they're numerous, in part because of, their behavioral responses to traffic, which is, like freezing the headlights, right? That classic, they really do that and they get hit. And so that has been how we've kind of been able to do these projects and get funding to build like wildlife crossings. But I think we've been able to expand on that a lot more recently. I used to say that, we're kind of building it for the deer. And, that's kind of our, I don't know, our catch, like how we're able to get the project done with the Department of Transportation. But then how can we make sure that crossing structure, that we design it so it also works for all the other species in that landscape? And so, that we are considering a kind of the full suite of wildlife and accommodating those movements.
And here in Southern California, it's the mountain lions, and I'll never forget driving around in Malaysia years ago and monkeys jumping out in the road, just like deer in Vermont. It was very alarming. Let's talk about some of your projects. I definitely want to get into the State Highway 9 project, because I know that there were 7 large crossings that were built, 10.4 miles of fencing, 62 motion controlled cameras at 49 locations. This sounds like sort of a best practice, is it?
Yeah, we learned a lot from that project. It was such a fun and positive project to be a part of. Early on, I was able to work with Colorado Parks and Wildlife on the design of the whole effort of all the crossings and other mitigation components. And then I was brought in to help lead the research study. We were able to do a 5-year-long monitoring research to measure, how is this working? We just invested all of this money in these wildlife crossings. Is it working? And how are different wildlife responding to it? And so it was such a positive effort. It was, like I said, it was a lot of fun. And it was Colorado's first system of wildlife crossings where we looked at this longer stretch of roadway and built multiple crossings, all connected with fencing, and then had what we call wildlife guards, which are kind of like a double cattle guard at all the driveways and access roads. And that prevents animals from getting into that fenced area and getting trapped on the road. And so we measured all of that with cameras. We also looked at the wildlife vehicle collision data. And there's a private conservation ranch in that area that has a lot of property. And they were a really instrumental partner in the whole project. They had been collecting, their staff were collecting reports on wildlife carcasses that they saw along the roadway and collected GPS points on all of those. So we had over 10 years of really comprehensive wildlife vehicle collision data that we don't usually have in most places, because wildlife vehicle collisions are just like notoriously underreported. But here we had this staff that had been, driving the roadway every day for 10 years and collecting these data. And so we were able to use that both to help inform the project, but also to measure the effectiveness of how much how much the mitigation was reducing collisions. And we found that it was reducing these collisions by 90%, which is just really phenomenal. And what I'd like to point out about that is these wildlife crossing systems, there is no other safety project that a Department of Transportation does that has a 90% effectiveness. So this is amazing that we can, improve the safety of our roads, especially in areas like the Roaring Fork Valley, where so many collisions are due to wildlife, and we can have a 90% effectiveness. So we were able to measure that on Highway 9. And then we were also, with all of our cameras, able to look at, all the different wildlife that were using these crossings, how they, whether they were using them successfully or whether they were repelling from the structure, and how those acceptance rates changed over time, how they adapted to the crossings mitigation over time. Because species like deer, they take to them really quickly, no problem. But elk, is a species that it takes them a few years to really adapt to crossing structure. And we were able to measure those changes over time by doing this long-term research.
That is really fantastic. And let's talk about costs, which nobody wants to talk about. But I know this Annenberg crossing out here in Los Angeles, $100 million, a huge number. Now that's an enormous highway that it's going over. But for example, on that State Highway 9, where there's 7 large crossings, must be talking what, $10 million each or something like that? Or what's the ballpark?
Yeah, keep in mind these were constructed in 2015 and 2016, so costs have gone up significantly since then. When CDOT did the project, they also decided to widen the roadway and do some other safety things like adding shoulders. And so the whole transportation project was about $50 million, but just the crossings and the fencing were about $20 million. And so that was for all 7 crossing structures and the 10.5 miles of fencing. So that was a pretty good cost. And obviously those costs have gone up over time, but keep in mind that that's a 2-lane highway. So the structures aren't as big as like the Wallace-Annenberg crossing, or in Colorado, we're building the Greenland overpass over I-25, just north of Colorado Springs. And that project is about, for that overpass, it's between 15 and $20 million. I think it's closer to 15. So, and that's one structure, but that's going over, 6 lanes.
6 lanes or something.
Yeah.
And do you ever go under? I mean, I remember when they built the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, and they elevated many sections of it so that the caribou could go underneath it. What's the pros and cons of going under versus over?
Yeah, honestly, a couple things. I mean, it depends on the terrain. So, is it feasible to build an underpass without, raising the road or encountering like I don't know, if you have a nearby creek and you have water issues or something like that. So we don't want to, there's a lot of places where we can build underpasses, but there's some places where it's just really hard to build an underpass. And there's other places where it makes more sense from a terrain standpoint. And a hydrologic standpoint to build an overpass. So terrain is one factor. The other really important factor is the wildlife themselves. There's different species that actually prefer to go under, and sometimes even prefer a smaller crossing. Like, we don't always need to build a huge crossing. So for example, like black bears will use drainage culverts. If they're not like a 10 by 10 drainage culvert, they'll cross through that. Bobcats, coyotes, a lot of those species, coyotes will also use overpasses pretty readily. But, and mule deer will use an underpass or an overpass. And it kind of matters more about where that structure is in the landscape relative to where they're trying to move and how long that crossing is. So, we don't want to build, especially for ungulates, our hoofed animals like deer and elk and moose and pronghorn, we don't want to build narrow, dark tunnels. These are prey species. They need to feel safe, and that they're not going to be, there's not a predator that's going to pop out on them. So they need to have it be open and daylit enough that they feel safe. So there's so many factors that we have to consider on a site-specific basis, but definitely, what are the species and what are they going to feel safe using is one of the most important considerations. And, along those lines, one of the cool things that we've been doing more of since that Highway 9 project is also, when we build these crossing structures for larger animals, what can we do for really small species? So, your deer mice, your, amphibians and reptiles and things like that. And so we've, even if they're not the reason we built that project and why it got funded in the first place, we can do things like build cover features that go all the way from one side of an underpass to the other to provide continuous cover through the structure so that they feel safe from predators and use those structures. And they're working really well. It's been a lot of fun to track that.
That's really cool. Well, I was impressed by your website and all the projects that you've done. You mentioned State Highway 9, I-25, US 285 corridor, US 26, Summit County. It goes on and on. And I imagine that this is an issue that goes across the country. And I imagine that the same issue is prevalent in other countries as well. Are you available as a consultant to go to other places and advise states about this?
Yeah, my website needs a little updating, I have to admit. It's pretty Colorado centric, and I have done a lot in Colorado, but I've also been working in Wyoming a good bit, both in Teton County, and there's a project that the state is trying to fund on US 26 around Du Bois for a couple wildlife crossings and fencing in that area. And then we've, I've also worked on several prioritization projects. So, looking at either a region or statewide level of where should we be investing in these projects? Because, like I said, we can't do this everywhere. So, where do we want to focus first? And so, kind of looking at where there's collision hotspots, looking at the wildlife data, and prioritizing for a state, where to work first. And so we just finished a study in Nevada, embarking on one in Virginia along those lines. So yeah, I love working in all these different places and taking lessons learned from one landscape to another, and also learning new things in that new place, because every situation's a little different. And so it's great to be able to work in different geographies.
And it sounds like you've really taken a collaborative approach, where I'm sure in the past it was an argumentative approach that people took. Hey, wait a second, you're forgetting this. Highway department, you're not caring for our communities, you're not caring for our wildlife. But you seem to be somebody that's taken a collaborative approach, and that's been quite successful. So
Yeah.
3 cheers. Let me ask you, how do you maintain balance in your life? I love asking this question, and I just looking at your LinkedIn page, it looks like you're an avid mountaineer. Skiing and hiking and biking. Is that how you're keeping balance and keeping yourself fresh and lively and successful?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely get tied to my computer a lot and have to pull myself away. But unfortunately, I have my dogs that need walking, and they get me out, and I appreciate that. But yeah, it really is getting out into these places that I love. Like the mountains absolutely feed my soul. And that's what, gives me the energy and the passion to do the things that I do. But I love, yeah, being outside and kind of pushing myself a little bit mentally and physically, but also just enjoying these places. I mean, it's beautiful, and it's so nice I feel so fortunate that I get to enjoy these landscapes and, literally have them out my back door.
You've really found a great niche.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. It was really fun chatting with you, and I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.
That's it. Thanks for listening to Flanigan's Ecologic. We'll see you next time.